Loretta and Danny had dated as teenagers.
They had been childhood sweethearts.
And when they reunited after 3 decades apart, their love affair appeared to have a storybook ending.
It just seemed like they were happy.
He'd always cared about her.
She seemed like the perfect wife.
But then, after 10 years together,
a mutual friend said, "Did you hear Loretta's husband left her?"
That he had run away with some waitress.
Danny's family was shocked and suspicious.
His new truck, his boat, tens of thousands of dollars worth of tools.
My father wouldn't leave anything behind that he worked for his entire life.
And the authorities would eventually be wondering, had Danny even left at all?
She was carrying around this huge secret.
One that would eventually be exposed.
She said, "Don't you dare open that door."
Mays Landing, New Jersey, September 1st, 2007. It was a quiet Saturday morning in this sleepy little town 20 miles from the neon of Atlantic City.
Mays Landing is a very rural area. You have a lot of farmland.
It's like every house is on 5 acres.
But that morning, Mays Landing was anything but sleepy. The local police had a mystery on their hands. A Pennsylvania man had just called in to report that his half-brother, 60-year-old Danny Burroughs, was missing.
He would come from Pennsylvania, and they would spend every weekend together, my uncle and my father.
But after skipping a few weeks of their weekend visits, Danny's brother showed up at the house in Mays Landing.
My father wasn't there.
But his wife, 56-year-old Loretta Burroughs, was. And she told her brother-in-law that Danny had left more than 3 weeks earlier on August 8th.
She said that he had run away with some waitress.
And that she'd last seen him driving away with his new girlfriend.
Mrs. Burroughs said that he pulled off in a yellow Hummer.
Loretta said it wasn't a temporary fling either.
He called her and said, "I'm down in Florida. I'm not going to come back."
Told her he was leaving her.
Shocked by the news, Danny's brother had immediately tried to reach him on his cell phone.
There was no answer.
And then, after several failed attempts to reach Danny, his brother had decided to call the police.
He was going to do anything to find out where my father was.
And then he called Danny's daughter, who immediately called Loretta.
I asked her what was going on.
And in answer, all she got was sobbing.
She was hysterical.
She said, "Yeah, he left me."
That's what Loretta said. But Danny's family would soon be wondering, had her old high school sweetheart really left her for another? Or was it possible he'd never left at all? Born in 1951, Loretta Tokish spent her childhood in suburban Philadelphia.
She grew up in Pennsylvania.
And so did Danny Burroughs.
She knew him from back in high school.
When they were like 17, 18, they knew each other.
But while Loretta and Danny did date,
she had an on and off relationship with him.
He also dated the woman who'd eventually become his first wife and the mother of his daughter.
My father chose to marry my mother.
Considering their on-off relationship, Loretta didn't appear too upset by the fact that Danny had chosen another. In fact, she soon met and married someone else too.
She was married to Joseph Doyle.
After they each got married, the former sweethearts grew apart, but neither marriage lasted. Danny's ended with a divorce, one that left him all but estranged from his 2 children.
I was 6 and my brother was 8, I believe, when my father, Danny, and my mother separated.
And in Loretta's case, it wasn't a divorce that cut things short. It was a tragedy. In 1994, 42-year-old Loretta called 911 and reported that she'd found her husband unconscious.
Joseph was taken to the ER and was pronounced dead.
He was apparently the victim of a drug overdose.
There were drugs found in his system.
In her 40s and with her daughter grown, Loretta was starting over. She worked a few receptionist jobs at an electrical supply company and a car dealership.
She was pleasant. She was nice. People liked her.
And she wouldn't be alone for long. In 1996, after an old classmate informed Danny that Loretta's husband had died, he looked up his old flame and contacted her with his condolences.
He'd always cared about her, always wanted to be with her.
That first phone call led to more, and eventually,
They got together.
although at first it was practically a long-distance relationship. By the time he reconnected with Loretta, he'd moved 45 minutes outside of Philadelphia to a home in rural Mays Landing.
The nice house. He really fixed it up.
Very handy at a lot of different things.
He also liked to build and fly model airplanes.
We used to go over in the field and watch him fly his airplanes when my kids were little.
And he nearly always had some sort of project going on in his garage.
Mr. Burroughs had a lot of tools and machinery.
But his first love was music.
One thing that my father loved the most, his passion for his drumming.
Although once he rekindled his relationship with Loretta and she moved out to Mays Landing, Danny would start enjoying new things.
They were always going out together.
And in 1999, the couple married in a simple civil ceremony.
I don't think at his age he really cared if it was flamboyant.
In fact, the ceremony was so low-key that Danny didn't even tell his daughter about it until several weeks after the I do's.
I just found out from going over there that they had gotten married.
And though the wedding was quiet, it was obvious that Loretta and Danny were thrilled with their marriage.
She seemed like the perfect wife. She just seemed like they were happy.
Danny made a decent living.
He was a truck driver.
And Loretta found work in a local retirement home.
Loretta was really well loved as someone taking care of the elderly.
Together, they made more than enough to get by, especially since Danny kept a tight rein on their expenses.
He was thirsty. He didn't get everything he earned in his life by spending all his money.
And over the next few years, it appeared that Danny and Loretta had settled into a comfortable life together.
He played music. They had people over.
Loretta reached out to Danny's kids, too. In fact, she deserved a lot of the credit for Danny's eventual reconciliation with the children from his failed first marriage.
She was open arms to me and my brother. She was always wanting to talk with us and be with us and invite us over. You know, she would be the one to call and say, you know, your father wants to see you. Get your brother together. See if your cousin wants to come. Bring your daughter. We're going to have a barbecue.
And in addition to Danny's children, Loretta was also a hit with the neighborhood kids.
She was just like everybody's grandmother.
Especially the daughter of neighbor Ann Roberts, who lived across the road and would often come over and swim in the Burroughs pool.
We go there all the time. All the time.
In fact, Ann regularly trusted Loretta to look after her little girl.
I would go to the store and she'd go, I don't want to go, Mommy. I want to go to Loretta, so I would drop her off there.
A good marriage, a good relationship with his kids, and new friends in the neighborhood. It looked like Loretta's romance with Danny was destined for a storybook ending.
She loved my father. She was happy.
But was Danny happy? Because in the summer of 2007, after 8 years of marriage, he'd apparently hop into a Hummer with another woman and head off for Florida. Coming up, did Danny simply walk out on Loretta?
He wanted to move to Florida to be close to my brother and me.
Or is there more to Danny's disappearance than it first appeared?
The police found that very suspicious.
It was September 1st, 2007, when Carolyn Burroughs got an alarming phone call from her uncle. Her father, 60-year-old truck driver Danny Burroughs, had vanished from his home in Mays Landing, New Jersey.
He called me and he told me, I filed a missing persons report on your father. We can't find him.
Not that Danny's wife, 56-year-old Loretta Burroughs, was looking for him. According to what she'd told his brother, Danny had left with another woman.
She said he left with some young girl.
Told her he was leaving her.
He just jumped in a yellow Hummer and went off to the sunset.
But as sudden as his exit was it entirely unexpected? Danny's family told the missing persons investigators that he'd had his heart set on Florida for a while. According to the family, Danny had been talking about Florida ever since his son and then his daughter both moved there.
He wanted to move to Florida to be close to my brother and me.
He even talked about starting a small business with his son.
My brother was happy about that.
However, there was one person who hadn't been happy with the plan: Loretta.
Her daughter was here and she had grandchildren here that she did not want to leave.
And as a result, Florida had been a sore spot between the couple for the past year or so.
When Daniel would talk about moving to Florida, Loretta would be behind him, shaking her head no, saying that they weren't going to go.
She was adamant that she was not going to Florida.
So had Danny simply gone without her? That's what Loretta said when Danny's daughter called her that weekend.
She told me that my father was not missing, that she actually had spoke to him days before, and that he was okay.
But if that were true, why hadn't Carolyn's dad returned any of her calls?
Something wasn't right.
Was it possible something had happened to him in Florida? And who was this mysterious waitress he'd run off with? Unsure what to do, the family contacted the police.
They did file a missing persons report.
But what would the police find? When they followed up with Loretta, she told them essentially the same thing she'd told her brother-in-law.
He left her to go to Florida. He left with a woman.
And when they asked around the neighborhood, the missing persons investigators discovered that the shocking news had already spread through the Burroughs rural community.
A mutual friend pulled in our driveway and said, "Did you hear Loretta's husband left her?" And I said, "Oh my God, no." And I called her up on her cell phone and she was crying.
She said that he had left her for another woman.
I felt bad. She was a nice lady.
But was it true? Danny's family had their doubts.
Daniel had always been in love with Loretta, so it just seemed odd to people that he would suddenly pick up and leave for someone else.
My father would never pick up and leave like that.
And then there was everything he'd left behind.
He would not have left his new truck, his boat, tens of thousands of dollars worth of tools.
Everything he owned and worked for his entire life was in that home.
And the idea that he'd been having an affair. One of Danny's neighbors, a man who'd known him for years, told the investigators that Danny had never said anything to him about hooking up with a younger woman.
He said, "Look, this is something guys say to each other. I've known him since the 70s. This is something I would have known."
In fact, the neighbor told the police that the last time he'd seen Danny, more than 3 weeks ago, everything seemed normal.
He was last seen on August 7th of 2007, riding his lawnmower.
And yet Loretta had been telling people that Danny had driven off with his new girlfriend the very next day.
Who mows their lawn the day before they're ready to leave with another woman? That's just crazy.
The police found that very suspicious.
And when the investigators did a quick check through their records, they made a surprising discovery, one that made them even more suspicious.
Loretta had a criminal background.
It turned out the woman neighbors considered everyone's grandmother was a convicted felon. In fact, she'd even been to prison twice.
She had done time both in state and federal prison.
Her first stint in prison stemmed from a 1996 incident when $484,000 had gone missing from the electrical products company where she was working.
She was charged with embezzlement. There were allegations that there were other financial improprieties.
And the subsequent trial revealed just why she had stolen the money.
She had a gambling problem.
You become so desperate that you need to pay back whoever you need to pay back.
Loretta had served 15 months on the first embezzlement charge, but it apparently wasn't long enough for her to learn her lesson.
After she spent time in prison, she was convicted again from stealing from a car dealership that she was working for.
And that led to yet another stint in prison.
She was in prison for embezzlement for quite some time.
Not that Loretta's legal troubles had any impact on her relationship with Danny.
My father went to visit her in prison.
Still, the pair of past convictions obviously made the investigators at least a little suspicious of Loretta. But they were a long way from convinced that she had anything to do with Danny's disappearance. As far as the police knew, Danny was alive and well in Florida.
There's no proof. There's no body.
There'd never been enough evidence.
Danny's daughter was convinced, though. Her father hadn't run off.
I actually talked to the detective. I was kind of upset. I adamantly told him, listen, this is not my father. I know my father, Danny. I know the type of man he is, and he wouldn't leave anything behind that he worked for his entire life.
And while the police were prepared to let the matter drop, she wasn't, not by any means.
I knew we were in for a fight to get to the bottom of what Loretta did.
Desperate for leads, the family took their fight to social media.
They had a Facebook page, Where is Danny?
They also plastered Mays Landing with flyers asking for information about the missing man. Flyers that produced few leads, but lots of gossip.
We were hearing that maybe she did something to him, maybe she, got rid of him.
Although not everyone was ready to believe the rumors. Loretta's neighbor, Ann, for instance.
I'd never thought that she would have did something to him.
After all, based on what Loretta told Ann, she appeared devastated by the breakup of her marriage.
She said she would never hook up with another man after what he did to her.
And Danny had apparently done more than just run off with another woman, too. According to what she told neighbor Ann Roberts, he'd also made off with Loretta's life savings.
She brought over a safe, and she asked my husband to open it up. And she was right on top of him, watching him open it, saying, oh my God, did he take all my money? Did he take all my money? And my husband got it open, and there was a bank statement there. And she said, he got me.
And hard up for cash, Loretta did the only thing she could.
She sold his belongings. She sold his truck, all his prized tools.
Or maybe she was just getting back at him for abandoning her. One thing was certain, for all her earlier openness, she no longer wanted anything to do with Danny's kids. In fact, soon after their father disappeared, she stopped communicating with them entirely.
No matter how many times we called Loretta, she never answered my phone call or my brother's.
However, with her neighbor Ann Roberts, things carried on as they always had.
We would go over her house. We would go in her pool. I would go over, have a glass of wine.
Loretta also continued to dote on Ann's daughter like a grandmother.
She would take her everywhere, buy her stuff.
In fact, Ann's daughter continued to occasionally spend the night at Loretta's, despite the rumors that she'd had something to do with her husband's disappearance.
And I'm like, she didn't do anything.
Coming up, Loretta moves on.
She sold my father's home.
But the one thing she held on to would be the big surprise.
You don't forget that smell.
By the spring of 2013, it had been more than 5 years since Loretta Burroughs' husband had disappeared from their home in Mays Landing, New Jersey.
She said he left her to go to Florida. He left with a woman.
But if that were true, Danny had never contacted his 2 children or his brother. Plus, he'd left all his most prized possessions behind.
His tools, his car, his truck, all the things that he had cared about, all the things that he had owned.
And that led them to believe there was a different explanation for his disappearance. Loretta.
I knew she did something to him.
They suspected, but they just couldn't prove it.
But while the family suspected Loretta, the police never found any evidence that she had done anything to Danny.
The police treated it as a missing persons case.
With no reason to believe there was foul play involved, the police figured Danny had done exactly what Loretta said, left her for a younger woman.
As an adult, you have a right to go wherever you wish.
And therefore, they'd long since closed the investigation into Danny's disappearance, much to his family's frustration.
What do? You just feel like you have no control over the situation.
But while Danny's family despaired, Loretta had moved on. In 2009, 2 years after her husband disappeared, she filed for divorce.
He didn't respond within a specific amount of time, and they let the divorce go through.
Then, once the divorce was finalized, Loretta had sold the house in Mays Landing that she'd shared with Danny for more than a decade.
She sold my father's home. She sold everything that he owned. We didn't even have a piece of clothing to remember my father by.
Although according to her old neighbor, Loretta was even more distraught about the sale than Danny's daughter. Apparently, Danny's sudden disappearance had left her in a severe financial bind.
She was just sobbing, crying, I can't believe I have to sell it, because she said she couldn't afford it anymore.
After the sale, Loretta had moved 20 miles away to Ventnor, New Jersey. Although she did remain in touch with Anne and her preteen daughter, who had even stayed overnight with Loretta one December.
I dropped her off over there. They were making Christmas cookies.
It had been just like old times, almost. Loretta had been as doting as ever. But at 58, she appeared to be growing stricter. When Loretta first showed Anne's daughter the guest room that night, she told the girl that the room's closet was absolutely off limits.
She said, don't you dare open that door.
At the time, Anne's daughter hadn't thought anything of the incident or mentioned it to her mother, and she continued to spend the occasional night with Loretta.
She really loved her. She would go there anytime.
All in all, Loretta spent 4 years in Ventnor, but in May of 2013, she was in the process of moving again, this time to nearby Cape May County.
Cape May is the next county to the south.
By then, Danny's daughter had given up all hope of finding her father.
I needed to detach myself in order to keep my life going.
But one member of the family hadn't given up, Danny's brother. And not long after New Year's of 2013, when he placed his now annual call to the authorities in Atlantic County, he had discovered something that gave him new hope.
The prosecutor's office, they had this brand new unit, the cold case unit.
So that February, Danny's brother had contacted the cold case unit.
They looked and said, wait a minute.
Not only did Loretta have an extensive criminal record,
She was involved with several different allegations of theft or misappropriation of money. She'd been to prison.
a previous husband had also died suddenly.
He is rushed to an emergency room and dies from a cocktail of Percocets and other pills.
Yet his family never suspected him to be a drug taker.
Taken together, her shady past and the previous husband's mysterious death had been enough to convince the cold case investigators that there might be something to the family's theory that Loretta had done something to Danny.
She was a suspect in their eyes.
But after so many years, could they find any incriminating evidence? After considerable digging, the cold case investigators had uncovered one promising possibility.
The power of attorney that was signed in order for Loretta to sell the house that she and Daniel had shared.
She apparently forged Mr. Burroughs' name on it.
If it was a forgery, Loretta's motive was pretty obvious. Without it, half the profit from the sale would have been held in trust for Danny.
He was supposedly still out there and could claim this money.
But more importantly, it was the leverage the cold case investigators had needed to get a judge to sign a search warrant.
There was plenty of reason to go look into the sale of the property.
So on the morning of May 17th, the cold case investigators knocked on the door of Loretta's new house in Cape May County.
The police were looking for paperwork in regards to selling off his properties.
Or at least that's what they said.
The 61-year-old grandmother, who'd been busy unpacking boxes when the investigators showed up, didn't appear to have anything to hide.
She said, go anywhere in the property.
But when the investigators told Loretta that another team was searching her old house in Ventnor, the one she was still moving out of,
Her face completely became white.
She became very nervous.
and she had reason to be nervous, because in the guest room closet, the investigators made a suspicious discovery.
2 big plastic containers wrapped in plastic bags.
You could tell there were multiple layers of bags.
There were air fresheners hanging there.
Dryer sheets and mothballs.
And yet, despite all the attempts to mask the odor,
as they started to open the levels of plastic bags, they started to smell something.
That they knew exactly what it was, her husband's body, or what was left of it.
After 5 long years, Danny Burroughs had finally been found. Danny had been hidden away in the guest room closet, the same one Loretta had always told Ann Roberts' daughter to stay out of.
My daughter slept in the bedroom where the body was found.
The strangest part of this story. I mean, people unfortunately kill their spouses. That's nothing new. But to keep them in their home, it's so scary.
However, the fact that Loretta had apparently held on to Danny's body for so long wasn't the only shock. After all, the investigators did find his remains crammed into 2 storage containers.
The body was cut in several parts.
It was also badly decomposed, not enough to prevent DNA analysis from confirming that the remains were Danny's, but enough to present quite a challenge to the medical examiner.
In a case like this, it's very difficult to determine the cause of death a lot of times because you don't have soft tissue on the body.
Still, as soon as the body was found, the investigators in Ventnor contacted their counterparts searching Loretta's house in Cape May, who immediately placed her under arrest. And they didn't need to tell her why.
When law enforcement came to the home, she knew ultimately what they were going to find.
She knew it was over.
Once under arrest, Loretta was transported back to Atlantic County and booked on murder charges.
Loretta Burroughs was interviewed by detectives from the Major Crime Squad and gave a statement to them in which she gave a reason for why this crime may have happened.
According to what Loretta told the detectives, it was rooted in her and Danny's ongoing disagreement over whether they should move to Florida.
She says that they got into an argument.
And she said that when Danny told her once and for all that he was going to Florida without her, Loretta said she'd become distraught, that she'd run downstairs to the kitchen and grabbed a knife.
She grabbed the knife to hurt herself.
But then, according to Loretta, the desperate gesture took an unexpected turn when Danny rushed into the kitchen and tried to wrestle the knife away from her.
Things got out of hand, and Loretta wound up stabbing Daniel.
And she said that before she could call 911 to summon help, Danny had died, sending her into a panic over what to do.
She decided to start dismembering him.
But why, the detectives asked, had she kept his body hidden in a closet all these years, even going so far as to move it from one house to another?
What was the point of that? Why didn't she just bury it? Why take it with her? It's just so bizarre.
And her answer was even more bizarre. Loretta told the investigators that she just couldn't bring herself to part with Danny. Coming up, will the prosecution's case come undone?
There were some problems with how she was questioned.
Or will a surprising new revelation about Danny provide the reasonable doubt the defense needs?
He had drugs in his system.
On March 11th, 2015, at the Atlantic County, New Jersey Superior Court, 63-year-old Loretta Burroughs went on trial for murder.
She murdered her husband several years ago and dismembered his body.
Loretta Burroughs did confess to police.
She admitted to stabbing him.
But the really shocking part of the story was what Loretta had done after Danny Burroughs was dead. She'd kept his decomposing body hidden in her house for almost 6 years.
How can anybody live with somebody's remains in their home?
That takes a special kind of person to kill, dismember, and then hold on to the body.
Not that there appeared to be anything special about the former retirement home employee when she sat down at the defense table that morning.
You know, Loretta Burroughs looks like your average grandmother.
You'd never think she was a murderer.
But in reality, the mild-mannered looking grandmother had spent the last 2 years in jail, awaiting trial for murder.
There was a $2 million bail set for Loretta.
She could not make the bail that was posted.
The district attorney had offered her a deal, however. Plead guilty, and she'd receive less than the maximum sentence.
For first-degree murder, it would be life.
But not much less.
She was offered 45 years.
For a 60-year-old grandmother, in essence, that's life in prison.
She had nothing to lose, so she took the case to trial.
And when the trial began, at least one thing appeared to be working in Loretta's favor. Because while she had confessed to stabbing Danny, the jury would never hear it.
There were some problems with how she was questioned.
The detectives did not properly Mirandize her and advise her that she had the right to an attorney.
So her entire statement was thrown out.
But would the prosecutors need Loretta's confession to prove she'd killed Danny? After all, she'd kept his dismembered body stashed in a closet for almost 6 years.
Based upon what happened to his corpse and what Loretta Burroughs did with it, it's not a gigantic leap of faith to suggest that she was responsible for his death.
At the very least, a natural cause of death appeared unlikely.
If her husband died by natural causes, your typical response is to call 911 and accompany the ambulance to the hospital.
Instead, the prosecutors said that Loretta had cut her husband up, hidden him in the closet, and started telling lies.
Loretta said Daniel left her for another woman.
But he'd never left. In fact, as the prosecutors explained, she'd even moved his remains when she bought a new house.
What we're ultimately left with here is extremely bizarre behavior.
That and some extremely graphic and disturbing images, which the prosecutors used to their full advantage.
When the jurors saw the images of Daniel Burroughs' dismembered body, what remained of it, there were gasps in the courtroom.
Between the condition of the body and the fact that her confession was off limits, the prosecution couldn't exactly say how Loretta had supposedly killed Danny.
The medical examiner could not find an exact cause of death.
But the prosecution did have a theory as to why Loretta had killed Danny, one that started with their disagreement about moving.
He wanted her to go to Florida and she didn't want to go.
However, according to the prosecution, staying in New Jersey wasn't Loretta's only reason for wanting Danny dead.
The primary reason for killing her husband was money.
Miss Burroughs had a big gambling problem all the way back to the 90s before she was with Mr. Burroughs.
And as prosecutors pointed out to the jury, Loretta's gambling addiction had almost driven her to desperate straits.
She had a few convictions for embezzlement and fraud. Apparently it was for her gambling habit.
And this time, the prosecution claimed that she'd opted for a new plan to come up with the cash she needed to fuel her addiction, murder Danny, and sell off everything he had accumulated over a lifetime.
Tens of thousands of dollars worth of tools, a new truck, a boat.
Exactly how much she'd made from liquidating his estate was tough to say.
She probably sold a lot of things for cash.
And then, after selling off Danny's things, she sold his house.
Loretta Burroughs benefits in excess of $70,000 from the sale of that home.
But what really interested the prosecutors was the power of attorney that Loretta used to get all the proceeds from the sale.
Loretta Burroughs had to get a power of attorney since she hadn't declared him dead.
According to the prosecutors, the document was a forgery, and they had 2 witnesses willing to testify to that too, both of whom just happened to have parents who were patients at the nursing home where Loretta worked.
She was overly nice to a patient whose daughter was an attorney and filed the power of attorney. She then was very nice and very caring to a patient whose son was able to notarize that power of attorney.
The prosecutor said that neither the attorney nor the notary was in on the murder plot. Instead, they were simply doing a favor for the kindly older lady who'd taken such good care of their parents. However, the prosecutors claimed that the fact that the document was a forgery wasn't the only important thing about it. There was also the timing, because the power of attorney was dated June of 2007.
She murdered him in August.
And according to the prosecutors, that proved that Danny's murder had been premeditated.
She was putting this plan into place 2 months before she killed him.
And the defense, how would they respond? Would they stick to the story that Loretta laid out in her confession?
That statement laid out a possible self-defense scenario.
But since her confession had been ruled off limits, the defense was caught in a bind.
With the statement being suppressed, the only way to advance that defense would be to put Loretta Burroughs on the witness stand.
And that was something her attorney was unwilling to do.
Loretta never took the stand.
With her prior criminal history, with her prior inconsistent statements, I think there's good reason why her attorney thought it wise not to put Loretta Burroughs on the witness stand.
Instead, the defense built its case around a surprise witness.
The defense actually had one of the state's witnesses come up, the medical examiner.
And questioned by the defense, he admitted to making a surprising discovery during Danny's autopsy.
He had drugs in his system.
It did come back positive for amphetamines.
Whether the amphetamines actually had anything to do with Danny's death, the medical examiner couldn't say.
We weren't able to get a quantification or an actual number of how much it was.
But the fact that he couldn't say was exactly the opening that the defense needed.
She is ultimately left with the typical reasonable doubt defense. The state is speculating that Loretta Burroughs caused his death because there's no proof that she actually did.
And since her confession had been tossed out,
we were not allowed to speak about that.
The defense was able to speculate too, suggesting that Danny could have died from any number of causes.
He may have killed himself, may have overdosed on drugs.
And what evidence the prosecution did have, Loretta's alleged financial motive was far from convincing, according to the defense.
The defense talked about how it wasn't really that much money. If they had gotten a real divorce, Loretta would have gotten more money maybe than she did.
In his close, the prosecutor countered by pointing out that there was a perfectly reasonable explanation for the drugs in Danny's system.
He had recent rotocuff surgery.
But then he reminded the jurors that while the defense was focused on the cause of death, they ignored the elephant in the room, or, to be more precise, the dead body in the closet.
The defense didn't really address the issue of how Daniel Burroughs' remains got in Loretta's closet.
That was never explained.
Mostly because they couldn't, not without incriminating Loretta.
The prosecutor said, okay, he goes into the house, he overdoses on drugs, and then he cuts himself up and puts himself into these containers.
There's only one way that could have happened. Loretta did it.
Coming up, will the jury find Loretta guilty?
If Loretta had gotten rid of her husband's remains, she would have gotten away with it.
Or is it possible she could still get away with murder?
If you don't know exactly what killed him, how could you prove somebody did it?
On March 17, 2015, the jury announced that it had reached a verdict in the murder trial of Loretta Burroughs. The 63-year-old grandmother was accused of killing her husband Danny in 2007 and keeping his dismembered body hidden in her closet for almost 6 years.
That blew me away. I'd never seen anything like that.
You have this very grandmotherly, sweet-looking woman who takes care of elderly patients, who was carrying around this huge secret.
But did that mean she'd killed him?
There are people who are going to argue if you don't know exactly what killed him, how could you prove somebody did it?
Although in the end, it only came down to what the 12 people on the jury thought.
They came back with a guilty verdict.
Loretta had little reaction to the verdict.
She just stood there, with her lawyer. She did a little cry, and then he patted her on the back. That was it.
Although at her sentencing hearing a month later, she did offer an apology for what she'd done, and she hinted at an explanation.
She talked about sometimes two people love each other too much.
When she was done, the judge sentenced her to 55 years in prison.
For murder and for hindering her own apprehension, because she cut him up and hid his body.
And while the 63-year-old was technically eligible for parole, for all practical purposes, it was a life sentence.
For murder in the state of New Jersey, you are serving 85% of your sentence before you are parole eligible.
She's going to die in prison.
For Danny's friends and family, the 8-year ordeal was finally over.
Finally, they were able to mourn Daniel and also to get the justice that they had wanted for him for all those years.
I feel she got what she deserved.
And all because, as Loretta told the police, she couldn't bear to part with him even after he was dead.
Everybody just wondered why you wouldn't have, after all these years, gotten rid of it.
If Loretta Burroughs at any point had gotten rid of her husband's remains, she would have gotten away with murder.
Florida, November 1984. Long before smartphones could pinpoint a person's location, before security cameras watched nearly every intersection, and before DNA databases transformed criminal investigations, people disappeared into the darkness with frightening ease. A quiet road could become the last place someone was ever seen. A passing car might draw no attention. A stranger offering a ride could vanish into the night as if he had never existed. In those days, investigators relied heavily on eyewitness accounts, physical evidence that was often incomplete, and countless hours of patient detective work. Every missing person case began with uncertainty, and every hour that passed without answers made the search more difficult. Few could have imagined that across the Tampa Bay area, a violent offender had already spent months hunting vulnerable women while leaving behind only scattered clues and devastated families. Even fewer could have imagined that the person who would finally help end the nightmare would be a 17-year-old girl who refused to surrender her ability to think. Her name was Lisa McVeigh, and although she could not know it at the time, the decision she made during one terrifying night would alter the course of one of Florida's most significant serial murder investigations. By the autumn of 1984, fear had quietly settled over parts of Tampa. Women were disappearing. Bodies were being discovered in vacant lots, along isolated roads, and in places chosen to delay identification. Investigators gradually realized that many of the victims shared disturbing similarities. Most were young. Many had been alone when they vanished. Evidence suggested they had been sexually assaulted before being killed. Yet despite the growing number of cases, there was no name, no photograph, and no obvious suspect. The killers seemed to appear without warning and disappear just as quickly, leaving detectives with little more than unanswered questions. The public knew only fragments of what law enforcement understood. Newspapers reported another body, another grieving family, another investigation with no arrest. Residents became increasingly cautious, especially women who worked late shifts or traveled alone after dark. Still, everyday life continued. People went to work, attended school, visited friends, and believed that ordinary routines would keep them safe. It was an illusion that would be shattered again and again throughout that year. On the evening of November 3rd, 1984, 17-year-old Lisa McVeigh finished her shift at work and began riding her bicycle home. There was nothing unusual about the trip. It was simply another late night after work, another familiar route through streets she had traveled before. She could not know that someone was watching, waiting for an opportunity that required only a few moments of isolation. At some point during that ride, a man stopped her. Within moments, she was forced into his vehicle. The ordinary rhythm of her evening disappeared, replaced by uncertainty and fear. Unlike many victims in similar circumstances, however, Lisa made a remarkable decision almost immediately. Instead of allowing panic to overwhelm her, she focused on something she could still control. If she could not control where she was being taken, she could control what she remembered. If she survived, every detail might become important. Throughout the hours that followed, Lisa concentrated on gathering information. She listened instead of speaking whenever possible. She paid attention to sounds that many people would instinctively ignore. She counted turns as the vehicle changed direction. She estimated travel time. She noticed changes in the road beneath the tires. Even while blindfolded for much of her captivity, she continued building a mental map of everything happening around her. Every airplane passing overhead suggested proximity to an airport. Every train whistle hinted at nearby railroad tracks. The smell of the surroundings, the sound of dogs barking, the hum of an air conditioner, the texture beneath her feet, and the layout she could partially sense inside the apartment all became pieces of a puzzle she hoped investigators might someday solve. Her determination did not stop there. According to the investigation, Lisa also attempted something equally extraordinary. Rather than allowing herself to become anonymous in the eyes of her captor, she spoke with him, trying to present herself as a real person rather than simply another victim. Investigators later believe this decision may have influenced what happened next, although no one can know with certainty what was going through the offender's mind. Lisa also intentionally left fingerprints inside the apartment whenever she believed she had an opportunity to do so. It was another calculated decision made under unimaginable pressure. She understood that if police ever located the place where she had been held, her fingerprints could help confirm her account. These were not the actions of someone who had given up hope. They were the actions of someone determined to create evidence while she still could. Nearly 26 hours passed. Every minute carried uncertainty. Every passing hour increased the possibility that she would never return home. Yet something unexpected happened. Instead of killing her, as he had done with numerous previous victims, the man drove Lisa back toward the area where he had abducted her and released her. She was alive. Physically exhausted and deeply traumatized, she nevertheless understood that time was critical. She did not simply return home and attempt to forget what had happened. She went to the police. Her experience, however, did not immediately produce the response one might expect. Some officers initially questioned her account. She had survived an ordeal that sounded almost unbelievable. More striking still was the incredible level of detail she could remember. Yet while some doubted, one investigator recognized that Lisa's observations were too precise to dismiss. Detective Larry Pinkerton listened carefully as she described everything she could remember. She identified characteristics of the vehicle. She described its controls. She recalled the number of turns during the drive. She remembered hearing airplanes overhead and estimated where those sounds had occurred. She described aspects of the apartment where she had been held. Each detail by itself appeared small. Together, they formed a coherent narrative. Investigators began comparing her recollections with known locations around Tampa. The route she described suggested an area near the airport. The combination of sounds, travel time, and environmental details allowed detectives to narrow their search far more effectively than before. For the first time in months, investigators felt they were moving toward a real suspect rather than chasing isolated pieces of evidence. At that moment, neither Lisa nor the detectives fully understood who they were searching for. They did not yet know that the man responsible was Robert Joseph Long, better known as Bobby Joe Long. They did not yet know that investigators would eventually connect him to at least 10 murders committed within only 8 months during 1984, along with dozens of sexual assaults stretching back years before the killings began. They did not yet know that he had already become one of Florida's most dangerous serial offenders. All they knew was that a survivor had provided information unlike anything they had previously received. Throughout the history of criminal investigations, there have been moments when years of painstaking detective work suddenly converge because one witness notices what everyone else overlooks. Sometimes it is a license plate. Sometimes it is a voice. Sometimes it is an ordinary object that appears insignificant until later. In this investigation, it was something even more remarkable. It was the ability of a frightened teenager to remain calm enough to observe, remember, and later describe details that most people would never have noticed under ordinary circumstances, let alone during captivity. Her memory would become one of the most valuable pieces of evidence investigators possessed. Yet this story is not solely about survival. It is also about the women who never had the opportunity to tell investigators what happened to them. Long before Lisa McVeigh escaped, 10 young women had already lost their lives. Each had a name. Each had a family waiting for answers. Their cases initially appeared disconnected because their bodies were found in different places and because forensic science in 1984 lacked many of the tools investigators rely upon today. Behind every crime scene stood grieving parents, siblings, relatives, and friends forced to confront unimaginable loss without knowing who was responsible. As detectives struggled to identify the offender, another family mourned, then another, until the pattern became impossible to ignore. Bobby Joe Long's crimes would eventually reveal not only the brutality of a serial predator, but also the immense challenges investigators faced during an era before modern forensic technology. His arrest would come only after months of persistence, careful analysis, and the extraordinary courage of one survivor who transformed fear into evidence. But before investigators could understand how the killings unfolded, they first needed to understand the man behind them. The story of Bobby Joe Long did not begin in Tampa during 1984. It began decades earlier with a troubled childhood, a series of personal difficulties, and a gradual escalation of violent behavior that investigators would later examine in an effort to understand how a serial rapist evolved into one of Florida's most notorious serial killers. In the next chapter, that background comes into focus, not to excuse the crimes that followed, but to understand the documented path that ultimately led to one of the darkest chapters in Tampa's criminal history. Florida in the early 1980s was a place of rapid growth. Cities expanded, highways connected communities, and thousands of people arrived each year in search of work and opportunity. For most residents, it was a place where ordinary routines defined daily life. Yet hidden beneath that sense of normalcy, investigators would later uncover the history of a man whose violent behavior had been developing long before the murders that would make national headlines. Understanding that history is important, not because it explains away his actions, but because it helps illustrate how law enforcement reconstructed the path of an offender after his arrest. Robert Joseph Long, later known publicly as Bobby Joe Long, was born on October 14, 1953, in West Virginia. His early years were marked by instability within his family. His parents divorced while he was still a child, and he was raised primarily by his mother. Beyond that basic outline, the available records included only a limited number of documented details about his upbringing. Investigators and later court proceedings examined those details because they sought to understand his personal history, not because those circumstances could excuse the crimes he eventually committed. During adolescence, Long experienced gynecomastia, a medical condition that caused abnormal development of breast tissue in males. According to investigative records summarized after his arrest, he was frequently ridiculed by other children because of the condition. Bullying during adolescence is a difficult experience for anyone, But it is also a common experience shared by many people who never commit violent crimes. For that reason, investigators and mental health experts were careful not to present this aspect of Long's life as a direct cause of his later offenses. It formed only one documented element of his background. Records also indicated that he suffered multiple head injuries during childhood. These injuries later became part of the defense's arguments during court proceedings. Attorneys pointed to them alongside claims regarding mental health in an effort to mitigate his responsibility. Ultimately, however, the courts concluded that despite those factors, Long remained legally responsible for his actions. The existence of head injuries was treated as documented background information rather than a justification for the crimes that followed. As he entered adulthood, Long struggled academically and left school early. Public records concerning these years reveal little about any stable career or long-term direction. In his life, he eventually married, but the relationship became marked by domestic violence. According to the case materials, he abused his wife, and the marriage ultimately ended in divorce. Investigators later viewed this period as another point in the gradual escalation of his violent behavior. Domestic abuse itself was a serious crime, but in Long's case it preceded an even more dangerous pattern that would emerge in the years ahead. Following the divorce, investigators concluded that his sexual violence intensified. Rather than isolated incidents of aggression, his behavior became increasingly predatory. Importantly, this progression was identified only after his arrest. When detectives reconstructed his history by combining victim statements, investigative records, and Long's own admissions. At the time these offenses were occurring, law enforcement did not yet realize that multiple crimes were connected to the same individual. Before the murders began, Long had already become known within investigative files for another reason. Detectives eventually associated him with a series of sexual assaults that became known as the work of the classified ad rapist. The nickname came directly from the method used to identify potential victims. During the early 1980s, newspaper classified advertisements were one of the primary ways people sold furniture, appliances, and household goods. Individuals would publish their home telephone numbers and addresses so interested buyers could arrange visits. For most people, this system was simply part of everyday life. Few imagined that someone would exploit it to identify women who were alone in their homes. According to Long's later admissions, he would read the classified advertisements, telephone women offering items for sale, and arrange appointments under the pretense of purchasing furniture or other household goods. By speaking with the sellers beforehand, he could determine whether they were likely to be alone when he arrived. Once inside, investigators determined that he used weapons to overpower his victims before committing sexual assaults. He then fled the scene before police could respond. At the time, these assaults presented enormous investigative challenges. The crimes occurred in different locations, involved victims who often had no connection to one another, and left relatively little physical evidence that investigators could use to identify a suspect. Modern forensic techniques that are now considered routine were not yet available. DNA profiling was still in its infancy and certainly not part of an extensive national database. Detectives instead depended upon fingerprints, witness recollections, physical evidence recovered from crime scenes, and painstaking comparison of reports filed across different jurisdictions. Even when similarities existed between cases, proving that the same offender was responsible remained difficult. As investigators later reconstructed the timeline, they concluded that Long committed numerous sexual assaults using this same general approach. After his arrest, he admitted responsibility for many of those crimes. Those admissions allowed detectives to revisit earlier investigations that had remained unsolved for years. For many victims, the arrest finally provided an answer to a question that had remained unresolved since the day they reported their assaults. Yet the investigation also revealed something even more disturbing. The pattern of offending was changing. Instead of ending after sexual assault, Long's violence continued to escalate. By the beginning of 1984, investigators determined that he had shifted from serial sexual assault to serial murder. The change dramatically increased both the danger he posed and the urgency of identifying him. During this period, Long relocated to the Tampa area. Detectives later found that his methods of selecting victims also evolved. Rather than relying primarily on newspaper advertisements, he increasingly targeted women in public spaces. According to investigative findings, his victims included young women walking alone at night, women waiting for transportation, prostitutes working along Nebraska Avenue, individuals returning home after work, and women who appeared isolated from others. Although their personal circumstances differed, they shared one tragic characteristic. Each was alone when she encountered the offender. Investigators determined that Long frequently drove through areas where vulnerable individuals were likely to be present. Sometimes he reportedly offered rides. In other cases, he used force to abduct his victims directly. The exact circumstances varied, but detectives recognized a consistent pattern of selecting individuals who had little immediate opportunity to obtain assistance. This pattern became one of the key behavioral links connecting multiple investigations. At the time, however, detectives could see only fragments of the overall picture. Each disappearance generated its own investigation. Each assault required its own interviews, evidence collection, and search for witnesses. Without today's integrated databases and rapid forensic comparisons, connecting those individual cases required extraordinary coordination. Detectives working separate investigations often had no immediate reason to believe they were pursuing the same offender. Only later, as evidence accumulated, did similarities begin to emerge. Looking back, investigators describe this period as one in which a dangerous offender was steadily increasing both the frequency and severity of his crimes while remaining unidentified. The gap between what detectives knew and what they did not know remained enormous. They understood that violent sexual assaults were occurring. They understood that the offender demonstrated planning by identifying isolated victims. They understood that the crimes shared important similarities, but they still lacked the single piece of evidence capable of identifying the man responsible. That absence of certainty would have devastating consequences as 1984 progressed. Over the next 8 months, investigators would no longer be dealing solely with reports of sexual assault. Instead, families across the Tampa area would begin receiving the worst possible news. Young women disappeared, and later their bodies were discovered in isolated locations. Each new crime scene added another layer to an investigation that was becoming increasingly urgent. Detectives gradually realized that they were no longer searching for a serial rapist alone. They were confronting a serial murderer whose attacks were becoming one of the most serious criminal investigations in Florida at the time. The next chapter examines that period in detail, focusing not on the offender's notoriety, but on the lives that were lost, the investigative connections that slowly emerged, and the growing determination of law enforcement to identify the person responsible before more families were forced to endure the same irreversible tragedy. By the middle of 1984, investigators in the Tampa Bay area faced a problem that is common in serial crime investigations before modern forensic technology. They possessed numerous pieces of evidence, but no clear picture of how those pieces fit together. Individual police departments were responding to missing persons reports, suspicious deaths, and homicide investigations that initially appeared unrelated. Each case had its own crime scene, its own witnesses, and its own timeline. Only through careful comparison did detectives begin to recognize a pattern. One of the first observations was that many of the victims shared similar circumstances. They were young women who had been alone shortly before they disappeared. Several were last seen walking, waiting for transportation, or spending time in areas where they could be isolated from others. These similarities did not immediately prove that the crimes were connected, but they prompted investigators to examine the cases side by side, rather than as independent incidents. The locations where the victims' bodies were discovered added another important element to the investigation. Detectives noted that the recovery sites appeared to have been selected to delay discovery rather than to represent the places where the crimes themselves had occurred. This distinction mattered because it suggested that the offender was using a vehicle to transport victims or their bodies. If correct, the actual crime scenes, and therefore much of the physical evidence, were located somewhere else. Medical examinations also revealed significant similarities across multiple cases. According to the investigative summaries, the victims had been subjected to sexual assault, and the causes of death showed consistent patterns that investigators believe indicated a single offender could be responsible. While each homicide required independent forensic examination, the recurring characteristics strengthened the theory that detectives were dealing with one individual rather than several unrelated offenders. Despite these similarities, identifying the offender remained extremely difficult. In 1984, investigators did not have access to nationwide DNA databases capable of comparing biological evidence from multiple crime scenes. Surveillance cameras were uncommon, especially along ordinary streets and commercial areas. Mobile phones with location tracking did not exist, eliminating investigative techniques that are routine today. As a result, detectives relied heavily on traditional police work, interviewing witnesses, comparing reports, studying maps, reviewing timelines, and looking for behavioral patterns that might connect one investigation to another. Another challenge involved jurisdiction. The bodies were discovered in different locations, meaning more than one law enforcement agency became involved over time. Sharing information required deliberate coordination, and detectives had to ensure that observations made in one investigation reached investigators working another. Building a comprehensive picture depended not only on forensic evidence, but also on communication among agencies. Investigators gradually identified several recurring characteristics they believed described the unknown offender. The individual appeared familiar with the Tampa area and its road network. The offender likely had regular access to a vehicle. He demonstrated an ability to locate women who were temporarily isolated, suggesting deliberate victim selection rather than random encounters. These conclusions did not identify a suspect, but they helped shape investigative strategy and guided future interviews and evidence reviews. The confirmed victims represented the central focus of the investigation. Each case involved a family seeking answers, and detectives worked to reconstruct the final known movements of every victim. Those efforts included interviewing relatives, friends, employers, and anyone who might have seen the victims shortly before they disappeared. Although the information collected varied from case to case, investigators hoped that even a small detail could reveal a common point of contact or a recurring location. As the number of linked cases increased, so did public concern. Law enforcement recognized that the offender remained active and that additional attacks were possible. Detectives continued reviewing existing evidence while simultaneously responding to new reports. The investigation therefore became both retrospective, attempting to solve earlier crimes, and preventative, with the urgent goal of identifying the offender before another woman was harmed. For months, however, the investigation produced no decisive breakthrough. Detectives believed they understood aspects of the offender's behavior, yet they still lacked the critical evidence needed to establish his identity. That changed only after a later abduction in which the victim survived and provided investigators with unusually detailed observations. Her testimony would supply information that traditional forensic methods alone had been unable to produce and would become a turning point in the case. The investigation into the Tampa murders changed dramatically after November 3, 1984. Before that night, detectives had been working with a collection of separate but increasingly connected cases. They had crime scenes, victim histories, and patterns suggesting that one offender might be responsible. What they lacked was a direct link to a living suspect. The person responsible had remained unidentified, and investigators had no reliable way to predict when or where the next attack might occur. The survival of Lisa McVeigh provided something the investigation had not previously possessed: a living witness who had directly encountered the offender and could provide detailed information about him. Lisa McVeigh was 17 years old when she was abducted while riding her bicycle home after work. Her experience became a critical part of the investigation because of the amount of information she was able to provide afterward. Rather than focusing only on what had happened to her, investigators also examined what she had observed during the time she was held captive. Her account was unusual because it contained details that could be compared with physical locations and investigative records. She described the vehicle used during the abduction, including characteristics of the interior. She recalled movements during the drive, including changes in direction and approximate travel time. She remembered environmental sounds, such as aircraft and other background noises, which could help investigators determine the area where she had been taken. These details were not treated as a complete solution by themselves. Investigators understood that witness memories can be affected by extreme stress and trauma. However, they also recognized that Lisa's observations were specific enough to be examined systematically. Detectives began separating information into categories: details that could be independently verified, details that could narrow the search area, and details that might help identify a particular suspect. One investigator who paid close attention to her statement was Detective Larry Pinkerton. Rather than dismissing the unusual nature of her account, he examined the information carefully. Each detail was considered as a possible investigative lead. The process involved reconstructing what could be reconstructed. Investigators considered the route the vehicle may have taken, the general area where the apartment might have been located, and environmental clues that matched her description. Slowly, the search area became more focused. This was a significant shift from the earlier stages of the investigation. Previously, detectives had been searching for an unknown person based primarily on patterns and crime scene evidence. Now they had a possible description of the offender's movements, habits, and location. The information from Lisa's statement was combined with other investigative methods. Detectives reviewed known criminal activity, examined possible connections between earlier cases, and looked at available records that might identify someone matching the developing profile. The investigation soon began focusing on Robert Joseph Long, known as Bobby Joe Long. At that time, detectives were not only examining the circumstances surrounding Lisa McVeigh's abduction, but also comparing him against the existing evidence from the Tampa murder cases. The connection between Long and the earlier crimes developed through a combination of investigative work and evidence. The search of his residence produced items that investigators considered relevant to the McVeigh case. Further examination connected him to the broader series of crimes that had remained unsolved. The arrest of Bobby Joe Long occurred on November 16, 1984, approximately 2 weeks after Lisa McVeigh's abduction. The arrest marked the end of an intense search, but also the beginning of a much larger legal process. Detectives now had to establish not only whether Long was responsible for the attack on Lisa, but whether he was also connected to the deaths of the women whose cases had troubled investigators. Throughout the year after his arrest, investigators continued working to build the complete case. The process involved reviewing evidence, examining statements, and comparing Long's account with the documented facts of each crime. During questioning, Long eventually admitted involvement in multiple offenses. However, investigators did not simply accept every statement without examination. Each admission had to be compared with independent evidence. In criminal investigations, a confession alone does not replace the need for verification. Detectives worked to determine which statements matched known facts and which required further investigation. The case against Long represented a major investigative effort that combined traditional police methods with the limited forensic tools available during the 1980s. It demonstrated the importance of witness information, particularly when physical evidence was limited. However, the investigation was also a reminder of the human cost behind criminal cases. While the arrest provided answers about who was responsible, it could not restore the lives that had been lost. The families of the victims had already experienced months of uncertainty, waiting to understand what had happened to their loved ones. The women whose names became part of the investigation were not simply evidence in a criminal case. They were individuals with families, relationships, and personal histories. The conclusion of the investigation brought accountability, but it did not erase the impact on those who had lost someone. The arrest also raised important questions for the justice system. How could an offender with a history of sexual assaults continue escalating before being identified? What challenges did investigators face when multiple jurisdictions were handling related cases? How could future investigations improve communication and evidence sharing? These questions became part of the broader discussion surrounding the case. The investigation occurred during a period when criminal justice agencies were beginning to understand the importance of recognizing patterns across seemingly separate crimes. The case would eventually move from investigation to prosecution. Evidence collected after Long's arrest would be presented in court, where prosecutors would attempt to prove his responsibility for the crimes and defense attorneys would challenge aspects of the case. The courtroom proceedings would become the next major stage of the process, a legal examination of evidence, responsibility, and punishment. After months of investigation, detectives had identified a suspect. Now the justice system would determine the consequences. The arrest of Bobby Joe Long in November 1984 brought an end to the immediate search for the person investigators believed responsible for a series of violent crimes across the Tampa area. However, an arrest was not the conclusion of the case. It was the beginning of another process, proving responsibility through the legal system. For investigators, the months following the arrest were focused on organizing the evidence that had been collected. The task was not simply to accuse a suspect, but to establish connections between Long and specific crimes through evidence that could withstand examination in court. The prosecution had to demonstrate several key points. They needed to show that Long was responsible for the attack on Lisa McVeigh, that he was connected to the murders under investigation, and that the evidence collected by detectives supported those conclusions. The case relied on multiple forms of evidence rather than a single piece of information. Investigators reviewed physical evidence obtained during the investigation, statements made by Long, and comparisons between known facts from individual cases. Each victim's case had to be examined separately because every homicide represented an individual crime involving a person whose life had been taken. The prosecution's responsibility was particularly significant because the victims were not simply part of a larger pattern. They were individual cases with individual circumstances. The families of the victims had spent months searching for answers, and the courtroom proceedings represented an attempt to establish accountability for each loss. Among the victims whose cases were connected to Long were Artis and Wick, Lana Long, Michelle Denise Sims, Elizabeth Loudenbach, Victoria Elliott, Kimberly Hops, Chanel Williams, Karen Dinsfriend, Virginia Johnson, and Kimberly Swan. Each woman had her own history, relationships, and future that ended abruptly. The legal process focused heavily on the evidence surrounding the murders. Prosecutors presented the circumstances of the crimes, the similarities between cases, and the investigative work that connected Long to the offenses. The pattern identified by detectives became an important part of understanding how the crimes were linked. Long eventually entered guilty pleas in multiple cases involving murder, kidnapping, and sexual offenses. However, the state of Florida continued to pursue the death penalty in the case involving the murder of Michelle Denise Sims. The decision to seek capital punishment reflected the severity of the crime and the state's position that the circumstances justified the highest possible penalty. The defense, meanwhile, examined Long's background and personal history, including documented childhood injuries and claims regarding mental health. The defense arguments did not dispute that Long had a violent criminal history. Instead, they focused on whether his background and psychological condition should influence the level of punishment imposed by the court. The legal system was required to consider both accountability and the circumstances presented by the defense. The presence of difficult experiences in a person's history can be examined during sentencing. But courts must also consider the harm caused by criminal actions and the protection of society. Ultimately, Long was convicted and received multiple sentences, including a death sentence for the murder of Michelle Sims. Other convictions resulted in additional severe penalties, including life imprisonment. Following the conviction, the case entered another lengthy stage, the appeals process. In death penalty cases, appeals often continue for many years. The purpose of appeals is not to repeat the original trial, but to review whether legal errors occurred that affected the outcome. Defense attorneys challenged aspects of the case through various legal proceedings, while prosecutors argued that the convictions and sentence should remain in place. For more than 3 decades, Long remained on Florida's death row while courts reviewed his appeals. During that time, the families of victims continued living with the consequences of the crimes that had changed their lives forever. The passage of time did not reduce the significance of the case. Instead, it highlighted the long process involved in capital punishment cases. Between conviction and execution, years of legal review can occur as courts examine constitutional questions, trial procedures, and evidence. Throughout these proceedings, the role of Lisa McVeigh remained one of the most discussed aspects of the investigation. Her survival and detailed account had provided investigators with critical information at a moment when the case lacked a clear direction. Her testimony became an example of the importance of victim and witness information in criminal investigations. However, the conclusion of the legal process was not only about the offender or the investigation. It was also about remembering the victims whose cases brought the investigation forward. The names of the women connected to the case represented more than evidence in a courtroom. They represented families who experienced loss, communities affected by fear, and investigators who worked to understand a series of crimes that developed over a short but devastating period. The case also demonstrated the limitations of criminal investigations during the 1980s. Today, investigators often rely on advanced DNA analysis, digital records, surveillance systems, and national databases. In 1984, detectives worked with far fewer tools. Their progress depended on interviews, cooperation between agencies, careful examination of physical evidence, and the ability to recognize patterns. The investigation into Bobby Joe Long became an example of how traditional detective work could eventually connect a complex series of crimes. It also showed how one survivor's ability to provide detailed information could change the direction of an investigation. On May 23, 2019, after more than 30 years on death row, Bobby Joe Long was executed by lethal injection in Florida. According to reports, he did not provide a final statement before the execution. For the justice system, the execution represented the final stage of the legal process. For the families affected by the crimes, however, there was no simple ending. A conviction could provide answers and accountability, but it could not undo the losses experienced decades earlier. The case remains significant not because of the notoriety of the offender, but because it illustrates several enduring issues in criminal justice. The importance of listening to victims, the challenges of investigating connected crimes, the evolution of forensic methods, and the responsibility of the legal system to seek justice while recognizing the human impact behind every case. The story of Bobby Joe Long ultimately returns to the people who were affected most directly, the women whose lives were taken, the families who searched for answers, and the survivors who carried the memory of what happened. Their experiences remain at the center of understanding the case. The conclusion of Bobby Joe Long's legal proceedings did not mark the end of the impact created by The crimes committed in Tampa during 1984. A criminal case may end with a conviction or a sentence. But for the people connected to the victims, the consequences continue long after a courtroom closes its doors. For the families of the women killed, the investigation had always been about more than identifying an offender. From the moment their loved ones disappeared, they were searching for answers. They wanted to know what happened, why it happened, and whether the person responsible would ever be held accountable. The passage of time did not erase those questions. Even after Long's arrest, prosecution, and conviction, the family still had to live with the reality that justice could not restore what had been lost. A legal decision could acknowledge responsibility, but it could not return the lives of the women who had been taken. The victims connected to the case came from different backgrounds and circumstances. Some were young women whose futures were still developing. Some were encountered while they were simply moving through their daily lives. Some were targeted while living on the margins of society. Circumstances that often make victims more vulnerable and can sometimes result in their cases receiving less immediate attention. The investigation into Long's crimes also demonstrated an important reality in criminal justice. Every victim's story matters. Early assumptions about victims can influence how quickly cases receive attention, how resources are allocated, and how investigators approach a search for answers. In this case, the eventual connection of multiple crimes showed that every missing person report and every unresolved assault represented a person whose life mattered. One of the most significant elements of the investigation was the role of information provided by survivors and witnesses. The case developed during a period when investigators had limited access to many of the technologies that are now considered standard. There were no modern DNA databases available to quickly compare evidence across jurisdictions. Digital records that can now reveal movements, communications, and connections did not exist. Instead, investigators depended on traditional methods. They interviewed people. They reviewed timelines. They compared reports. They studied similarities between cases. They followed small details that might connect one investigation to another. Lisa McVeigh's account became a central example of the importance of witness information. Her ability to remember details during an extremely traumatic event provided investigators with information they could use. Her observations helped create a path toward identifying a suspect at a time when other evidence had not yet produced an answer. Her experience also raised broader discussions about survival responses during traumatic events. Not every person reacts the same way during a crisis. Some may fight, some may attempt to escape, and some may focus on observation and cooperation as a means of survival. McVeigh's actions reflected her individual response to an extraordinary situation. After the case, McVeigh became associated with law enforcement and victim advocacy discussions. Her story was often referenced as an example of how survivors can contribute important information to investigations. However, the focus remained on the fact that no victim should ever have been placed in that position. The investigation also influenced conversations about how law enforcement agencies handle connected crimes. The Long case showed the importance of communication between departments when multiple crimes share similar characteristics. Before the widespread use of integrated criminal databases, connecting cases required significant effort. Detectives had to recognize patterns through reports, interviews, and shared information. When crimes occur across different locations, delays in communication can allow offenders to continue. The case became part of a broader shift in criminal investigation practices. Over time, law enforcement agencies increasingly develop systems designed to identify patterns among crimes, share information more efficiently, and use scientific methods to support investigations. However, technology alone does not solve crimes. The foundation remains careful investigative work, attention to detail, and respect for victims and witnesses. The case also illustrates the importance of separating explanation from excuse. During court proceedings, Long's background was examined. including childhood experiences, medical history, and psychological evaluations. Understanding an offender's history can be relevant to legal proceedings and criminal research. However, those factors do not remove personal responsibility for choices and actions. The courts ultimately determined that Long was responsible for his crimes and that the evidence supported the convictions against him. The sentence reflected the severity of the offenses and the justice system's response to the harm caused. On May 23, 2019, the state of Florida carried out Long's execution by lethal injection. After more than 3 decades of legal proceedings, the case reached its final procedural stage. But the lasting memory of the case is not defined only by the person convicted. It is defined by the people whose lives were affected. The 10 confirmed victims remain the most important part of the story. Their names represent real individuals rather than statistics in a criminal investigation. They represent families who experience loss, communities that live through fear, and investigators who work to understand a series of crimes that had created uncertainty across Tampa. The case of Bobby Joe Long remains a reminder of the challenges faced by investigators when crimes occur before modern forensic tools are available. It shows the importance of cooperation between law enforcement agencies, the value of careful evidence collection, and the critical role of survivors in the justice process. It also serves as a reminder that behind every criminal case are human beings. The purpose of investigation and prosecution is not simply to identify an offender, but to seek truth for those who have suffered. The events of 1984 changed many lives permanently. The investigation eventually reached its conclusion, but the memory of the victims continues to be the central reason the case is remembered. Their stories are the reason justice was pursued. Their lives are the reason the investigation mattered. And their families are the people who carried the consequences long after the headlines disappeared. The case of Bobby Joe Long represents one of the most significant criminal investigations in Florida during the 1980s, not because of the attention surrounding the offender, but because it revealed the difficult realities faced by victims, investigators, and the justice system when confronting a pattern of violent crime. Looking back at the investigation, the sequence of events can be understood through several stages. The initial reports of sexual assaults, the discovery of connected murders, the search for a suspect, the breakthrough provided by a surviving victim, the collection of evidence, and the eventual court proceedings. Each stage depended on the work of many individuals. Detectives who compared reports, forensic personnel who examined evidence, officers who followed leads, prosecutors who presented the case, and witnesses who provided information all contributed to the final outcome. The early investigation was shaped by limitations. In 1984, law enforcement did not have many of the resources available today. The absence of advanced forensic databases meant that investigators could not simply enter evidence into a system and receive an identification. Instead, they had to build connections manually. The similarities between cases became one of the most important investigative tools. Detectives examined victim profiles, circumstances surrounding disappearances, locations where bodies were discovered, and evidence collected from each scene. The purpose of identifying patterns was not to create assumptions, but to determine whether separate cases might actually represent the actions of the same offender. This process required caution. In homicide investigations, connecting cases incorrectly can damage an investigation and affect innocent people. Investigators therefore had to balance urgency with accuracy, ensuring that conclusions were supported by evidence. The discovery that multiple victims shared similar circumstances changed the direction of the investigation. Instead of treating each case independently, law enforcement began searching for a common explanation. The crimes also demonstrated how offenders who commit repeated acts of violence may not always be immediately identified. Prior offenses can remain hidden, particularly when victims are isolated, when evidence is limited, or when different incidents are handled separately. The earlier sexual assaults associated with Long became important because they showed a progression of criminal behavior. Investigators later recognized that the person responsible for those assaults had escalated to more serious violence. This connection was not obvious at the beginning. It became clearer only after detectives examined the complete picture. The arrest of Long provided answers to many unanswered questions, but it also created new responsibilities for the justice system. Prosecutors had to present evidence in a way that demonstrated responsibility beyond reasonable doubt. Courts had to evaluate not only what happened, but whether the evidence met legal standards. The trial process examined questions of guilt, responsibility, and punishment. The defense presented information about Long's background, while prosecutors presented evidence of the crimes. The courts ultimately determined that Long was responsible for the offenses and imposed severe sentences. The appeals process that followed reflected another important part of the American justice system. Even in cases involving extremely serious crimes, defendants have the right to challenge legal decisions. Appeals exist to review whether proper procedures were followed and whether constitutional protections were respected. This process lasted for decades. During that time, the families of victims continued living with the consequences of the crimes while the legal system completed its review. The final execution in 2019 closed the legal chapter of the case, but it did not represent a simple ending for everyone affected. For survivors of violent crime, the effects can continue long after an offender has been identified. Trauma does not disappear when a courtroom reaches a verdict. Families do not stop missing their loved ones because a sentence has been carried out. This is why modern discussions of criminal cases increasingly emphasize the importance of victims' experiences. The investigation is not only about evidence and procedures. It is also about understanding the people behind the case files. The women killed in the Tampa area during 1984 should be remembered first as individuals. They were daughters, friends, relatives, and members of their communities. Before their names appeared in police reports and court documents, they had ordinary lives and personal stories. A criminal investigation necessarily focuses on facts, dates, locations, evidence, and legal decisions. But those facts exist because real people were affected. The case also highlights the importance of listening to victims of sexual assault. Many crimes remain difficult to investigate because victims may face fear, uncertainty, shame, or disbelief when reporting what happened. A justice system depends on creating conditions where victims can come forward and be taken seriously. Lisa McVeigh's role in the investigation became widely recognized because her information helped detectives identify a suspect, but her story should not overshadow the experiences of other victims. Her survival and the losses of those who did not survive are both parts of understanding the complete impact of the case. Ultimately, the investigation into Bobby Joe Long was a study in persistence. Detectives worked with limited technology but continued searching for connections. Families continued seeking answers despite uncertainty. Survivors continued carrying the memories of what they experienced. The case demonstrates that criminal justice is not only about punishment after a crime occurs. It is also about prevention, investigation, accountability, and learning from past failures. The lessons from the Long investigation influence broader conversations about how law enforcement agencies identify patterns of serial offending, how information is shared between jurisdictions, and how victims are supported throughout the legal process. Decades later, the most important conclusion remains the same. The focus of any criminal case should ultimately return to the people harmed. The crimes committed in Tampa in 1984 caused irreversible damage. The investigation eventually identified the person responsible, and the courts delivered a final judgment. But the lasting legacy of the case belongs not to the offender. It belongs to the victims. It belongs to the families who endured unimaginable loss. It belongs to the investigators who worked to uncover the truth. and it belongs to the survivors whose courage helped bring answers when they were most needed. The investigation into Bobby Joe Long has often been remembered because of the scale of the crimes, the difficulty of identifying the offender, and the unusual circumstances that eventually led to his arrest. But behind every report, every piece of evidence, and every courtroom decision were people whose lives were permanently changed. Criminal cases are often recorded through official documents. They are organized into timelines, evidence lists, police reports, and court transcripts. These records are necessary because they allow the justice system to examine facts. However, documents can never fully represent the human experience behind them. The women connected to this case were not defined by the circumstances of their deaths. They were individuals with their own lives, relationships, and futures. The investigation eventually placed their names into public records, but before that happened, they were known by their families and friends in much more personal ways. The purpose of examining a case like this is not to focus on the offender's actions as a source of fascination. The more important questions are about how crimes are investigated, how victims are supported, how evidence is evaluated, and how society responds when innocent people are harmed. The events of 1984 revealed challenges that investigators faced during an era before many modern tools existed. Detectives had to work without the advantages that are now common in criminal investigations. There were no widespread DNA databases, no digital tracking systems, and no constant network of surveillance cameras. Instead, investigators depended on traditional methods. They depended on careful interviews, cooperation between agencies, examination of physical evidence, and the ability to recognize connections between cases. The eventual identification of Bobby Joe Long was not the result of one single action. It was the result of many investigative steps working together. Each interview, each comparison between cases, and each piece of evidence contributed to building a clearer picture. The survival of Lisa McVeigh became a major turning point because it provided investigators with information they previously lacked. Her ability to remember details under extreme circumstances demonstrated the importance of survivor testimony in criminal investigations. However, her experience also represents a larger truth about violent crime. Survivors should never be expected to carry the responsibility of solving the crimes committed against them. The responsibility belongs to the offender and to the justice system tasked with responding. The investigation also raised important questions about how warning signs are recognized. Long had a history of sexual offenses before the murders occurred. Examining that history afterward showed how criminal behavior can escalate when offenders remain unidentified or when earlier offenses do not result in intervention. This does not mean every offender follows the same path, nor does it mean that past difficulties automatically predict future violence. It does, however, demonstrate why reports of violence and abuse must be taken seriously. The case also emphasized the importance of communication. When crimes occur across different locations, connecting information quickly can make a critical difference. Modern law enforcement has developed more advanced systems for sharing intelligence, but those improvements were shaped partly by lessons learned from investigations such as this one. For the families of the victims, the conclusion of the case brought accountability, but not restoration. No conviction can reverse a loss. No sentence can return someone who was taken away. Justice operates within limits. It can establish responsibility. It can recognize wrongdoing. It can provide an official answer, but it cannot erase grief. That reality is one of the most important things to remember when examining any true crime case. Behind every investigation are people waiting for answers. Behind every victim's name is a life that existed before the crime. Behind every courtroom decision are families who must continue living afterward. The Bobby Joe Long case remains part of criminal justice history because it demonstrates both the difficulties and the possibilities of investigation. It shows how law enforcement can face uncertainty and eventually uncover the truth through persistence and cooperation. It shows how evidence, testimony, And careful analysis can transform an unclear investigation into an established case. But the deepest lesson is not about the offender. It is about the importance of remembering victims as people rather than simply as elements of a crime report. The women whose lives were lost in Tampa in 1984 remain at the center of this story. Their names represent the reason the investigation mattered. Their families represent the lasting impact of violence. Their experiences remind us that the purpose of justice is not only to punish those responsible but also to acknowledge the harm done and protect others from experiencing the same tragedy. More than 3 decades after the investigation began, the case reached its legal conclusion with the execution of Bobby Joe Long in 2019. Yet the meaning of the case continues beyond that final event. It continues in the discussions about victim support. It continues in improvements to criminal investigations. It continues in the lessons learned by law enforcement. And most importantly, it continues in the memory of those who were lost. The final chapter of this case is not a story about the person who committed the crimes. It is a reminder of why investigators searched, why prosecutors pursued justice, and why victim stories must remain at the heart of every investigation. The Bobby Joe Long investigation remains an important example of how criminal cases evolve over time. At the beginning, investigators did not have a complete understanding of what they were facing. They were responding to individual crimes, each involving separate victims and separate circumstances. Only through careful review did those individual cases become recognized as part of a larger pattern. This process is common in complex investigations. A single incident may appear isolated until additional information reveals similarities. Detectives must constantly evaluate whether new evidence changes their understanding of earlier events. In the Long investigation, the connection between cases developed gradually through comparison of circumstances, forensic findings, and witness information. One of the central challenges was the lack of immediate identification. Investigators had evidence that indicated a dangerous offender was active, but evidence showing that an offender exists is different from evidence identifying who that offender is. This distinction is important in criminal investigations. Police may understand how crimes are occurring, recognize patterns, and develop theories about an offender's behavior, yet still require additional evidence before they can legally accuse a specific person. During 1984, detectives worked within the limitations of their time. Modern investigators often rely on interconnected databases and advanced technology, but earlier investigators had to build cases through direct examination and coordination. They reviewed reports manually. They compared details from different investigations. They interviewed people repeatedly. They searched for inconsistencies and connections. Much of this work involved patience rather than dramatic breakthroughs. The eventual identification of Long demonstrated the importance of combining different sources of information. Lisa McVeigh's account alone did not replace the need for investigation. Instead, it provided a direction that investigators could pursue and compare against other evidence. This principle remains relevant in modern investigations. Witness information, physical evidence, forensic analysis, and investigative experience are most effective when they support one another. The case also demonstrates why early reports of sexual violence are important. Before the murders occurred, Long had already been associated with numerous sexual assaults. These earlier offenses represented serious harm to victims, even before the investigation revealed the later killings. Each assault was a crime deserving attention and investigation on its own. Looking back at the complete timeline, investigators were able to see a pattern of escalation. The earlier offenses became part of understanding how the larger series of crimes developed. For victims of sexual assault, the decision to report a crime can be extremely difficult. Fear of not being believed, concern about public judgment, and emotional trauma can create significant barriers. A justice system depends on creating an environment where victims are heard and where their reports are treated with seriousness. The Long case also highlights the importance of avoiding assumptions about victims. Some of the women connected to the investigation were involved in circumstances that historically caused victims of crime to be unfairly judged. However, a person's occupation, personal situation, or lifestyle never reduces the value of their life or the importance of investigating crimes committed against them. Every victim deserves equal attention and protection. Another important aspect of the case is the relationship between investigation and public safety. During the months when Long remained unidentified, law enforcement faced the difficult task of protecting communities while lacking a confirmed suspect. Authorities needed to provide information without creating unnecessary fear. They needed to encourage caution while continuing their investigation. These situations require careful communication because public trust can affect the success of an investigation. The eventual arrest provided answers, but it also revealed how quickly criminal behavior can escalate when an offender remains unknown. The transition from sexual assault to murder demonstrated the importance of recognizing patterns of increasing violence. For criminal justice professionals, cases like this are studied not because they are unusual stories, but because they reveal areas where systems can improve. Those improvements include better communication between agencies, more effective methods for identifying connections between crimes, greater support for victims and survivors, continued development of forensic science, training focused on recognizing patterns of repeat offending. The investigation also reinforces the importance of evidence-based decision-making. Criminal cases cannot rely solely on suspicion or public pressure. Investigators must establish facts. Courts must evaluate evidence. Legal decisions must follow procedures designed to protect both public safety and individual rights. The case of Bobby Joe Long involved extensive legal review because the consequences were severe. The death penalty requires careful examination because it represents the highest punishment available within the justice system. The decades between conviction and execution also demonstrate the length and complexity of capital cases. Appeals and legal reviews are part of the process, allowing courts to examine whether decisions were made according to constitutional standards. While these procedures can be lengthy, they reflect the principle that serious punishments require serious review. Ultimately, the Long investigation is remembered for several reasons: the number of victims, the challenges faced by detectives, the importance of survivor testimony, and the long legal process that followed. But the most important perspective remains the same. The case is not defined by the person who committed the crimes. It is defined by those who were harmed. The investigation existed because families needed answers. The evidence mattered because victims deserved justice. The legal proceedings mattered because society needed accountability. When examining historical criminal cases, there is a responsibility to remember that behind every investigation are real people. Their experiences should not become secondary to the details of the offender's actions. The lasting lesson from the Bobby Joe Long case is therefore not simply how one offender was identified. It is how communities, investigators, and the justice system responded after terrible crimes occurred. It is a reminder that careful investigation matters, that victims' voices matter, and that the pursuit of justice begins with recognizing the humanity of those whose lives have been affected. The Bobby Joe Long case remains a difficult chapter in the criminal history of Florida because it brought together many of the challenges faced by law enforcement when confronting a violent offender, whose crimes span multiple victims and locations. The investigation was not defined by one single moment, but by a series of decisions, observations, and efforts made by many people over time. At the center of the case were the victims. When criminal investigations are discussed years later, there is often a tendency to focus on the person accused or convicted because that individual becomes the subject of court records, news reports, and historical summaries. However, The true purpose of an investigation is not to create recognition for an offender. It is to restore truth for victims and their families. The women connected to the Long investigation were more than names listed in police documents. They were people whose lives existed beyond the circumstances that brought them into a criminal case. They had families, personal experiences, relationships, and futures that ended because of violence. The investigation into their deaths represented an effort to answer questions that their loved ones had been forced to carry. What happened? Who was responsible? Would anyone ever be held accountable? Those questions are at the heart of many unsolved and solved criminal cases. For families, justice is often not about achieving a perfect sense of closure. Instead, it is about having the truth recognized and having responsibility assigned to the person who caused the harm. The Long investigation also demonstrated the importance of persistence in criminal justice. During the early stages, detectives did not have all the answers. They did not know the identity of the offender. They did not know how many crimes were connected. They did not know whether the next investigation would provide the breakthrough they needed. They continued working because each victim represented an obligation to continue searching. The development of the investigation showed how criminal cases are often built. Evidence rarely appears as one complete answer. Instead, investigators collect small pieces of information and determine whether those pieces form a consistent picture. A witness statement may reveal a direction for further investigation. A physical detail may connect one case to another. A pattern may become visible only after reviewing information that initially appeared unrelated. In the Long case, the information provided by Lisa McVeigh became significant because it offered investigators a new path forward. Her survival and ability to provide detailed observations changed the direction of the investigation. Her experience also became an example frequently discussed in relation to the role of survivors in criminal cases. It demonstrated the importance of listening carefully to victims and recognizing that information, provided after trauma, can be valuable to investigators. However, it is equally important to remember that responsibility for solving crimes does not belong to victims. Victims should never be expected to carry the burden of preventing future crimes or identifying offenders. That responsibility belongs to those who commit crimes and to the systems designed to investigate them. The case also reflects how criminal investigation has changed over time. In 1984, investigators worked with limited forensic resources. Today, advances in technology allow law enforcement to analyze evidence in ways that were not previously possible. DNA databases, digital records, and improved information sharing systems have changed how many investigations are conducted. But technology is only one part of justice. The foundation of any successful investigation remains the same: careful attention to evidence, cooperation between investigators, respect for victims, and commitment to finding the truth. The Long case also illustrates why prevention and early intervention are important. The investigation later revealed a history of sexual offenses before the murders occurred. Understanding that history became part of examining how the crimes developed over time. The case does not suggest that every person who commits an offense will follow the same path. Human behavior is complex, and criminal responsibility belongs to the individual who chooses to commit harm. However, the progression of offenses demonstrated the importance of taking reports of violence seriously and responding effectively. For law enforcement, the case became an example of the challenges involved in identifying serial offenders. These investigations require balancing urgency with accuracy. Acting too slowly can allow additional harm to occur, while acting without sufficient evidence can damage the investigation and affect innocent people. The justice system must therefore operate carefully, relying on facts rather than assumptions. The trial and appeals process reflected this principle, because the charges involved the most serious crimes and the possibility of the death penalty. The courts conducted extensive legal review. The process lasted decades, demonstrating the complexity of capital cases. On May 23, 2019, Bobby Joe Long was executed by lethal injection in Florida. His death ended the legal proceedings, but it did not end the significance of the case. The impact remained with the victims' families, survivors, investigators, and communities affected by the crimes. The most meaningful way to remember this case is not through the details of the offender's actions, but through the lessons it provides. It reminds society that victims must be believed and supported. It reminds investigators that careful work and attention to detail can make the difference between an unsolved case and an answer. It reminds the justice system that accountability requires both evidence and fairness. And it reminds communities that behind every crime statistic is a human life. The story of Bobby Joe Long is ultimately a story about the search for truth after unimaginable harm. It is about investigators who continued searching despite uncertainty. It is about survivors who carried memories of traumatic experiences. It is about families who waited for answers. Most importantly, it is about the women whose lives were taken. Their identities should not be reduced to their connection to a criminal case. They should be remembered as individuals whose lives had meaning before tragedy occurred. The investigation eventually reached its conclusion, but the responsibility to remember remains. Justice may arrive through arrests, trials, and sentences, but remembrance belongs to everyone who seeks to understand the human consequences of crime. And in the end, the lasting lesson of this case is not about the offender who was finally identified. It is about the people who deserve to be protected, the families who deserved answers, and the continued importance of building a justice system that places victims at the center of its purpose. The investigation into Bobby Joe Long's crimes took place during a period of transition in American criminal justice. The 1980s represented a time when law enforcement agencies were beginning to develop more coordinated methods for handling patterns of violent crime. Yet many of the technological resources considered essential today were still unavailable. The case demonstrated how difficult it could be to identify a repeat offender when crimes occurred across different locations and involved different victims. A single department might have information about one assault or one homicide, while another department held details about another incident. Without modern systems for immediate information sharing, recognizing the connection between cases depended heavily on communication and the ability of investigators to identify similarities. In this investigation, the process of linking crimes required examining more than the circumstances of individual incidents. Detectives looked at common elements, the circumstances in which victims disappeared, the locations where evidence was found, the methods used by the offender, and the characteristics shared across cases. This type of analysis became a foundation for what would later develop into more advanced approaches to identifying serial offenders. The case also emphasized the importance of preserving and carefully evaluating evidence. In major criminal investigations, evidence does not always provide immediate answers. Sometimes its importance becomes clear only after additional information becomes available. A statement that appears limited at one point in an investigation may later become significant when compared with other evidence. A detail that seems unrelated may help establish a connection between separate events. Investigators working the long case had to approach the evidence with patience. They were not simply searching for confirmation of a theory. They were attempting to establish a factual understanding of what had occurred and who was responsible. This approach is essential because criminal investigations involve consequences that affect many lives. An incorrect conclusion can harm innocent people, while a failure to identify a dangerous offender can leave communities at risk. The case also reinforced the importance of treating survivors as important sources of information and support rather than only as witnesses in a legal process. After traumatic events, survivors may remember details differently. Some memories may be immediate and clear, while others may emerge gradually. Investigators must approach these accounts carefully, recognizing both the effects of trauma and the potential value of information provided by survivors. Lisa McVeigh's account became significant because investigators were able to examine her observations and compare them with other evidence. Her experience showed how careful listening and detailed documentation can influence the direction of an investigation. However, the broader lesson extends beyond one individual. Every survivor who reports a crime contributes information that may help investigators understand what occurred. Creating a system where survivors feel safe reporting crimes is therefore an important part of public safety. The case also highlighted the importance of supporting victims after an investigation ends. Criminal proceedings often focus on evidence, charges, and legal outcomes, but survivors and families continue dealing with the emotional effects long afterward. For families of homicide victims, the conclusion of a case may answer questions about responsibility, but it does not remove grief. The legal system can provide recognition of wrongdoing, yet the personal impact of loss remains. This distinction is important when examining the purpose of justice. Justice is not only about punishment. It is also about acknowledging harm, recognizing victims, and creating accountability. The Long case became part of discussions about how society views victims whose circumstances may differ from public expectations. Some victims in the investigation were women who lived in vulnerable situations, including those involved in prostitution. Their circumstances did not make their lives less valuable or their deaths less worthy of investigation. A fair justice system must recognize that every victim deserves dignity and equal attention. The investigation also demonstrated the importance of understanding offender behavior without allowing that understanding to overshadow victims. Studying criminal patterns can help law enforcement prevent future crimes, but the focus must remain on protecting people and reducing harm. After his conviction, Long's case continued through the appeals system for many years. This period reflected the structure of capital punishment cases in the United States, where extensive review is required because of the irreversible nature of the sentence. The decades between conviction and execution also meant that the case remained part of public discussion long after the original investigation ended. On May 23, 2019, the execution of Bobby Joe Long concluded the formal legal process. However, the significance of the case remains connected to broader questions. How can law enforcement identify patterns earlier? How can agencies communicate more effectively? How can victims be supported throughout investigations and trials? How can communities respond when violence occurs? These questions continue to shape criminal justice today. The lasting importance of the case does not come from the offender's actions alone. It comes from the lessons learned through the response. The investigation showed the value of persistence when evidence is limited. It showed the importance of connecting information across separate cases. It showed the power of careful witness interviews. And it showed why every victim's story deserves attention. When looking back at the events of Tampa in 1984, the central focus should remain on those who suffered the greatest loss. The women who were killed, the survivors who carried the consequences, and the families who lived with unanswered questions were the reason the investigation mattered. The work of detectives, prosecutors, and the courts existed to serve them. A criminal case may eventually produce a name, a conviction, and a sentence. But the deeper purpose of justice is to ensure that victims are remembered, that their experiences are acknowledged, and that society learns from the failures and challenges revealed by tragedy. The Bobby Joe Long case remains a reminder that behind every investigation is a human story. The evidence tells us what happened. The legal system determines responsibility. But remembrance ensures that the victims remain more than names in a record. They remain the reason the search for truth began. A criminal investigation eventually reaches a conclusion. Evidence is collected, suspects are identified, trials are completed, and courts issue decisions. Yet the human consequences of violent crime do not follow the same timeline. For families and survivors, the aftermath continues long after the final legal document is signed. The Bobby Joe Long case illustrates this reality clearly. The investigation had a beginning, a middle, and a legal conclusion, but the experiences of those affected by the crimes cannot be contained within those stages. The pain experienced by families, the memories carried by survivors, and the questions left behind are part of a much longer process. When investigators reviewed the cases connected to Long, they were not simply examining a series of criminal events. They were reconstructing the final moments of people's lives. Every report represented someone who had once been part of a family and a community. This perspective is essential in understanding major criminal cases. Statistics can describe the scale of an investigation, but they cannot fully represent the individuals involved. The 10 confirmed victims connected to the Long investigation were each separate human stories. Their names appeared together in official records because they were connected by the actions of one offender. But their lives before those crimes were unique. They had personal histories that existed independently from the investigation. They had people who knew them, cared about them, and remembered them beyond the circumstances that brought their names into public attention. For investigators, identifying the victims and establishing what happened to them was one of the most important responsibilities of the case. A homicide investigation is not only about finding the person responsible. It is also about restoring a sense of truth for those left behind. Families often spend months or years living with uncertainty when a loved one disappears or when a crime remains unsolved. The absence of answers can create a different kind of suffering, one built around unanswered questions. The identification and conviction of an offender can provide some recognition that the victim's experience has been acknowledged. It confirms that what happened was real, that responsibility has been assigned, and that the victim has not been forgotten. The investigation also demonstrates the importance of examining criminal behavior over time. Long's offenses did not appear suddenly without warning. Investigators later identified earlier sexual assaults and patterns of behavior that preceded the murders. Reviewing that history became important for understanding the development of the case. It showed how criminal behavior can escalate and why reports of violence must be taken seriously. For law enforcement, one of the difficult challenges in cases involving repeat offenders is recognizing connections before more harm occurs. Each individual incident may appear limited when viewed alone. A single assault, a missing person report, or an unexplained disappearance may not immediately reveal the larger pattern. However, when information is shared and examined collectively, those connections may become visible. This principle has influenced the development of modern investigative practices. Today, agencies place greater emphasis on information sharing, behavioral analysis, and coordinated responses to repeated patterns of violence. The lessons learned from past cases contribute to improvements in future investigations. Another important aspect of the case is the role of evidence in establishing truth. Criminal justice requires more than suspicion. It requires facts that can be examined, challenged, and evaluated through legal procedures. The investigation into Long involved multiple forms of evidence and testimony. Detectives had to build a case that could withstand scrutiny in court. This process required careful documentation and verification. The purpose of evidence is not only to identify an offender. It is also to ensure that conclusions are based on reliable information. The court system exists because serious accusations require careful review. This principle remains important even in cases involving extremely harmful crimes. Justice requires both accountability and a fair process. The decades-long legal proceedings after Long's conviction reflected this balance. Appeals and reviews are part of a system designed to examine whether legal standards were followed. For families of victims, however, the length of legal proceedings can also create another emotional challenge. The case may remain present in their lives for years as courts continue reviewing decisions. The final execution in 2019 closed the legal process, but it did not close the memories of those affected. The importance of this distinction cannot be overstated. A criminal sentence represents the response of the justice system, but grief and recovery belong to individuals. The case also highlights the importance of survivor support. People who experience violent crimes may face emotional challenges long after the immediate danger has passed. Support systems, understanding communities, and responsible reporting can play important roles in helping survivors move forward. Lisa McVeigh's later involvement in law enforcement became one example of how survivors may transform their experiences into efforts that help others. Her story is often discussed because of the role her observations played in the investigation. At the same time, her experience should be understood within a larger context. No survivor should ever have to become the key to stopping an offender. The responsibility always belongs to the person who commits the crime. The broader meaning of the Long case is therefore not simply that an offender was eventually identified. The deeper lesson is about the systems and people required to respond after violence occurs. It is about investigators who continue searching despite uncertainty. It is about victims whose lives deserve to be remembered. It is about families who continue carrying the impact of loss. It is about survivors whose experiences deserve recognition and support. And it is about a justice system that must continue learning from every case it handles. The passage of time changes many things. Technology advances. Investigative methods improve. Communities change. But one principle remains constant. Every victim deserves to be seen as a person first. The records of the Bobby Joe Long investigation will always contain dates, locations, evidence, and legal decisions. Those details are necessary for understanding what happened. But the most important part of remembering the case is recognizing the human lives behind those records. The investigation ended because answers were found. The justice process ended because legal decisions were completed. But remembrance continues because the impact of these events reached far beyond the courtroom. The lasting responsibility is not simply to remember that crimes occurred. It is to remember who was affected. It is to recognize why the investigation mattered. And it is to ensure that the victims remain at the center of the story. The investigation into Bobby Joe Long's crimes remains a significant example of the challenges involved in solving a series of violent offenses. It demonstrates how criminal cases are built gradually, how evidence must be carefully examined, and how the work of investigators often continues long after the public attention surrounding a case has faded. In many investigations, the public sees only the final result, an arrest, a conviction, or a sentence. What is less visible is the long process that comes before those moments. It involves reviewing reports, interviewing witnesses, examining evidence, comparing information, and repeatedly returning to unanswered questions. The Long investigation followed this pattern. At the beginning, detectives did not have a complete picture. They had separate incidents involving different victims and different circumstances. Over time, similarities began to emerge, creating the possibility that the crimes were connected. Recognizing those connections was one of the most important steps in the investigation. Criminal investigations involving multiple victims require investigators to look beyond individual incidents. They must understand both the details of each case and the broader pattern that may connect them. This requires careful analysis because similarities alone are not enough. A connection must be supported by evidence. In the Long case, detectives examined the circumstances surrounding the victims, the locations involved, and the available evidence. Gradually, the investigation moved from uncertainty toward identification. The case also showed the importance of timing. Investigators often work under pressure because an unidentified offender may continue committing crimes. Every unresolved case represents not only a search for answers about the past, but also an effort to prevent future harm. The survival of Lisa McVeigh became a critical moment because it provided investigators with information they had not previously possessed. Her ability to describe details about her experience helped create investigative leads that could be compared against other evidence. Her role in the case has often been discussed because it demonstrates the value of careful observation and communication between survivors and investigators. However, the broader lesson is not that victims must provide perfect information. Survivors respond to trauma in different ways, and every response is valid. The responsibility for preventing crime belongs to offenders and to the systems responsible for addressing criminal behavior. The case also highlights why law enforcement must approach victims with seriousness and respect. A person reporting a crime is not simply providing information for an investigation. They are often sharing one of the most difficult experiences of their life. The way authorities respond can influence whether victims continue participating in the justice process. Beyond the investigation itself, the case became part of wider discussions about criminal justice practices. It showed the importance of improving communication between agencies and developing better methods for recognizing patterns of repeated offending. Over time, criminal justice systems have changed significantly. Advances in forensic science, information technology, and investigative cooperation have transformed how many cases are handled. However, the basic principles remain unchanged. Investigators must search for facts. Evidence must be evaluated carefully. Victims must be treated with dignity. Courts must make decisions based on established legal standards. These principles form the foundation of a fair justice system. The legal outcome in the Long case brought accountability through conviction and execution. But accountability and healing are not the same thing. For families who lost loved ones, the pain caused by violent crime does not disappear when a case ends. They continue remembering the people they lost and carrying the impact of what happened. That is why victim-centered approaches are so important. Remembering victims is not an additional part of a criminal case. It is the reason the investigation exists in the first place. The names associated with the Long investigation should not be remembered only because of the crimes committed against them. They should be remembered because they were individuals whose lives had value before tragedy occurred. Their families and friends knew them through ordinary moments, personal relationships, and shared experiences. Those aspects of their lives existed long before they became part of an investigation. The final chapter of the case is therefore not about the offender. It is about what society chooses to learn from tragedy. It is about recognizing the importance of early intervention when violence is reported. It is about improving systems so information can be shared more effectively. It is about supporting survivors. It is about ensuring that investigations remain focused on truth rather than attention. The story of Bobby Joe Long is ultimately a reminder that criminal justice is a human process. Behind every piece of evidence is an event that affected real people. Behind every court decision are individuals whose lives were changed forever. The work of investigators brought answers. The courts established responsibility. But remembrance remains the responsibility of everyone who studies and discusses the case. The most important legacy of the investigation is not the name of the person convicted. It is the recognition that victims matter. Their lives mattered before the crimes. They mattered during the investigation. And they continue to matter long after the legal process has ended.